Dun dun dun.
500,000 years ago, this planet was crawling alive with hominids. It would appear that Homo erectus stomped his way out of Africa into what we now call Mesopotamia or the Middle East, and then into Europe and into Asia and every conceivable place he could walk thereafter. Maybe even every conceivable place he could boat thereafter. There's a lot we don't know about those guys. But 100,000 years ago, that we know of, on this planet, there were Homo sapiens. There were Homo Neanderthals, Homo Denisovans, Homo florensis. And doubtless there were more, maybe countless more. And they'd spread all over the world, and they ran into one another.
What's going on
Did you know?
there? Hello?
Unless you are descended from sub-Saharan ancestry, you have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4% Neanderthal. Isn't that strange? And that's about as solid as an indication as can be found, that I can think of, anyway, that our Homo sapien ancestors, at least a lot of our Homo sapien ancestors, a lot of us who have, a lot of us have Neanderthal ancestry also. It means the Homo sapiens, they ran into some Neanderthals. They also ran into some Denisovans. You know, what's really strange is somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans shared a common ancestor. And then a few 100,000 years later, when the Cro-Magnons, or the anatomically correct human beings, or anatomically modern Homo sapiens, first ran into them, they were two entirely different groups, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And still, somehow, human beings, all of us hominids, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo florensis, and they interacted, and they bred, you know. Neanderthal people, it's really strange. It's really trippy. I kind of dig the topic, but Neanderthal people, they had larger brains than we have today. They had larger eyes. They had larger faces in relation to their skull size. They were shorter than even the Homo sapiens of their time, but we can tell by looking at their bones that they were obviously much stronger. Their joints were thicker and wider, and it seems that they had more of a robust immune system. And we know they were social, you know. Remains have been found of an old Neanderthal man who had suffered what appears to be a crippling injury, but it was an injury that indicated he had healed from it and had lived for years afterwards, which means that somebody took care of him, somebody to whom he was valuable. Neanderthals, they made some remarkable tools for the day. We don't really have a solid indication that they weren't as smart, if you will, as Homo sapiens. The biggest argument there is that Homo sapiens are still around and Neanderthals aren't. Exactly. But that's a little bit screwy, you know. We're talking about a group who obviously was social, right? We're talking about a group who had worked out how to manufacture the oldest known man-made material. It was a kind of a pitch glue, and the process for making this was very complicated, and it required some serious precision on temperatures and things like that as they were cooking it up. They made tools that were so sharp that the edges of their edge tools, anyway, could be 1 molecule thick. 1 molecule thick. That is rather sharper than human industry makes things today, by the way. I just point that out. We have found tons of their remains. We find them all over the place in Europe. You know, enough that scientists began to recognize consistent sets of injuries among them, by the way. That same set of patterns can be found today only in cowboys, especially rodeo competitors, bull riders, and bronc riders, people whose lifestyle leads them to pick a fight with a 2,000-pound animal. That's not a lot of us today. And I think it's a little curious that many of the animal remains found in Neanderthal sites, the bones, they're the predecessors of a great many of our large domesticated livestock. You know, they're the aurochs, and they're the predecessors to the horse. They're dire wolves. They're the predecessors to the goats and the sheep. And many of those bones seem to be from animals who died in their prime. Now, if you're an animal, if you're a hominid, if you're anything that hunts other animals, that's a remarkable batting average. You know what I mean? Like, if you make your living off of hunting other animals, especially large animals and large herd animals and things like that, where you do the best, where you the most successes, the highest number of successes, is to go after the very old animals or the very young animals, or somehow animals which are infirm. They're just easier to catch. They're easier to catch and kill. And so the averages would say, well, there ought to be a lot of sick ones in there. It certainly shouldn't be a whole lot of animals in their prime. Now, again, it's really tricky because there's so much we don't know. There's such a big gulf of time in between today and way back then when Neanderthals were around. And it would appear that they died out somewhere around 35 to 40,000 years ago. And when I say died out, I mean the people who were the most Neanderthal, predominantly in Neanderthal, died out about that in that time frame. And so we find the things that we find about them in caves. But it's not outside the possibility, the realm of possibility, can't even talk right now, that they didn't have a lot of things outside these caves. You know, a cave is protected from a whole lot of bullshit. There's a lot of rain that doesn't fall inside a cave. There are a lot of temperature fluctuations that don't occur inside a cave. And so, for all we know, they had encampments, maybe even built houses, and the bulk of their things occurred out in the wild, and there's nothing of it that we can see today. And maybe these caves, these protected sites, they might have been of particular importance, and that's certainly a possibility. It's a possibility that, hey, we had a great day, a phenomenal day. We had an amazing day today hunting, us Neanderthals, and we managed to take down a mammoth, or we managed to take down this primo, top-notch, top of his game auroch. This is a special day. Let's carve him up in the holy cave. And that's possible. It certainly is. You know, we still don't know what happened to them. Did we breed them out? Did we outcompete them? Did we starve them out? Did we fight them out? You know? It's often reckoned that we're smarter than they were, but I'm not so sure. You know, the people doing the reckoning when they say that kind of thing, well, for the most part, they're scientists. They're smart. They're thinky sort of people. They're the kind who might take some measure of pride in their own ability to think and not take some pride into being the captains of the all-star team. And they often lean toward the idea that however we outlasted the Neanderthals, that we are the smarter ones. But that might not be true. They absolutely had larger brain averages than we do, you know. And if you were to consider, well, but the neuronal density might be entirely different. And that's possible also, but in modern primates, neuronal density doesn't seem to change very much. Meaning that pound for pound, comparable parts in the nervous system may not contain all that many more or less neurons from primate to primate. Certainly not from hominid to hominid. Of course, then you've got the architecture of the brain itself to consider, you know. And the brain's the keystone of the human central nervous system. Because whether you like it or not, our central nervous system, our entire central nervous systems, do a lot of our thinking for us. It's not all just that shit that happens behind your eyes. But the differences in that architecture, they can really drive some pattern recognition differences. They really can. But do we have all that much evidence that they had dissimilar architecture? You know, Neanderthals, they had useful traits. For those of us that have have inherited some of their DNA. Their traits, they had been forged on the anvil of the northern hemisphere in its very unique cycle of ice ages. Many of these traits have passed on into populations of Homo sapiens who are in part descended from them. And it's not that the ice ages didn't occur into the southern hemisphere as well, but the northern hemisphere seems to have suffered the most severe of the march of the glaciers, for example. Neanderthals, some of that stuff that they leave us, so many of us anyway, about 2 to 4% from person to person, it might seem to represent, it's possible that it represents approximately 30% of the Neanderthal genome. And that's so in other words, if you were to take all of the bits and pieces of human beings out today that were Neanderthal, and you were to stack those all together, you might have rather a lot of a Neanderthal, comparatively speaking, instead of the 2 to 4% that a human being has inherited. Hairier backs, for example. Those are, by the way, they're better for creating an insulating air gap between your skin and your clothing, and that could become a critical deal if you're living in the northern hemisphere through an ice age, you know. That insulating air gap, that might become important. Their bodies, by the way, seem to have been built to maintain core temperatures under much colder conditions than average, and their nose and their nasal passages seem to be larger and more protruding, which would seem to be better suited for warming and humidifying air, which is frigid. They had apparently a very robust immune system, their immunoresponses. Given that so many of these traits are still being represented in human populations some 35,000 years after, maybe 40,000 years after the last Neanderthal seemed to have died out, that there are bits of these Neanderthal genomes that are still represented in human populations today, that indicates that those little bits were very useful for success over time. Let's talk about the genetics behind this for a minute, okay? So you get half of your DNA from your mother, approximately, and approximately half from your father. Now, there are some things which you will exclusively inherit from one parent or the other. Like your mitochondrial DNA came exclusively from your mother. And if you're a guy, you have a Y chromosome, and that chromosome came exclusively from your father, and so your X chromosome came from your mother. Now, if you're female, one of your X's came from your dad's mother, through him to you, and the other one came from your own mother, from her mother. Okay? But once you get... it still boils down to approximately half of your father and approximately half of your mother. And so approximately a fourth of your dad's father and approximately a fourth of your dad's mother, and then approximately a fourth of your mom's mother and your mom's father. And these are approximations. They're not 100%. It's not like exactly 50% and exactly 50%. It's approximate, okay? So you're getting about that. And it's a very general about. And so once you go a generation back there, what would have been about half of your father, well, you're not precisely, however imprecise that half might be from your father, the value of half, well, even more imprecision from the generation behind him, right? And so the farther back you go, the greater the potential for smaller than average for any generation back, the smaller bits that you would have inherited from that ancestor, that potential exists, okay? And so once you've gone back about 6 or 7 generations, you start running into the very real possibility that you have an ancestor that far back, maybe even 2, from whom you've inherited no actual discernible DNA, okay? And it's not to say that they're not your ancestor. It's just to say that the approximately half that you get from each parent and the approximately half that they get from each parent and so on and so forth. By the time you get 6 generations back, it's certainly a possibility that there's an ancestor who you have not inherited any genetics from, any discernible genetics from, okay? So that's just 6 or 7 generations back. So imagine 20 generations back. Rather, more of those ancestors left you very little, if any, at all, of their DNA. But Neanderthals, as such, died out 30,000 years ago. You know, that's rather more than 20 generations back. It comes from a very, very long way back. Many, many generations. So many that we can't do anything more than a very vague guess. But if your ancestry is from anywhere except sub-Saharan Africa, you will have some discernible Neanderthal DNA. And again, the current averages seem to be between 2 and 4%. 2 to 4% of your human DNA inherited from Neanderthal ancestry from 40,000 years ago. And that means that there were rather a lot of traits floating around in the human population today that have been, at least through some of the most, well, at least for most of the last 60,000 years of Homo sapien history, those traits have been of great utility because it's stuck around in so many people's DNA for so very long. And when you compare it to anybody else from anybody else whose ancestry comes from that same location, and they also have a 2 to 4% representation of Neanderthal ancestry, of Neanderthal DNA, you can be pretty sure that it's been selected for. And it's not all the same pieces. There are a whole lot of traits which would be represented by that 2 to 4%. And it ain't all hairy backs or an immune system so strong that it'll eat away at your joints, maybe because it's bored. There are all kinds of traits. You know, it's possible that red hair and freckles. We don't know. We don't know because there's so much we don't understand about the genome in general. So why aren't there Neanderthals still today? If they all had traits, if 30% of the Neanderthal genome is still represented in human populations today, even though each one of us could be bearing somewhere between 2 and 4%. That's current wisdom, conventional wisdom. Why aren't they here? You know, were they maybe not as sociable as Homo sapiens? I keep wanting to say human beings, but it's painfully obvious that these were humans. They were hominids. They lit fires. They wore clothes. They took care of each other. They almost certainly talked. I can't imagine how they would get the things done that they got done without speaking. But if you look at the shapes of their skulls versus the shapes of our skulls, and honestly, you can still see some Neanderthal traits slightly represented just in the shapes of people's skulls. You know, they had, for example, a significant brow ridge compared to Homo sapiens. They did not have a chin, by the way. And they tended to have wasn't exactly a muzzle, not like a chimpanzee or a gorilla, but they didn't have a chin. They had a big nose. Because Homo sapiens, our skulls, kind of almost seem like they were more domesticated. You know, and if you look at the shape of our skull, even an adult, his skull is shaped a lot like a juvenile Neanderthal. Or hasn't changed all that much. If you look at the difference between a juvenile Neanderthal or a baby Neanderthal skull versus an adult, and you compare a baby Homo sapien skull versus an adult, there are a lot bigger changes in between a baby Neanderthal and an adult. Is that indicative of more domestication on our part? And here's what I mean by that. Domestication, they could have been, Homo sapiens might have been able to function in larger and tighter social groups. And here's where that idea takes me, okay? It takes me to the group network, like a beehive or a wolf pack or a mold colony, only because we're talking about humans with articulated rules. And here's what words and consciousness allow you to do. They let you use other people's minds to analyze data and identify patterns only inside your own mind, okay? So what I mean by that is, let's say you and a friend are working on a problem together. You're working on a problem together. Now, this person's a friend. You've interacted for quite a while. You're on great terms. You function together well. So you know one another's minds fairly well, okay? And so you're communicating about the problem because you're going to see things about it and he's going to see things about it. And they're not always going to be the same things. It's one of the benefits of functioning in a group is you get to rely on another set of senses and another set of decisions, right? And so you have that as backup, okay? So, but your mind is a conscious mind, and his mind is a conscious mind, and you're used to interacting with him. And so when you come up to a problem together, the way your mind works is you look at the problem and you look at it as you begin, your mind is approaching the concepts of the problem in ways that you have fine-tuned for all of your life, while also running, to some degree, the approach that your buddy might also be taking. And you're familiar with this. You're equipped to do this because he's your buddy. There's a lot about the way that he thinks that you know and have relied on for however long. And so you are bringing something like two minds to the problem yourself. Meanwhile, your buddy is doing the exact same thing. He's bringing his mind to bear on the problem, but also because he's interacting with you, he's bringing a representation, however accurate, of the way you approach problems inside his own head. And so it's not precisely two minds working on the problem. It's the two minds that you're handling in your head, and it's the two minds that he's handling in his head. Or it's certainly not unlike that, entirely unlike that. And so it's almost like the total amount of minds being brought to bear squared. Okay? So imagine, if that's the case, imagine the ways in which three guys are able to problem solve. Three guys are able to safely take down a bear with bows or spears, and they're able to do it every single time, and no one ever gets hurt. Okay? Now imagine what sorts of patterns become identified, and the magnitude of the problems which can be contended with when you've got a dozen minds who are working together. Okay? And then imagine when you've got 200 minds who can cooperate. The social interactions between that many people gets really complicated. And it gets complicated enough that some bodies might work out how to, grow crops reliably. And imagine when you've got a few thousand people, now that's sustainable, that's a sustainable population because of agriculture. Imagine what those people do. They invent shit like math as a proxy for the normal give and take of any small group so that you can keep track of whose brother-in-law owes you a goat. And what kind of things does a network of 10,000 people come up with? Maybe a new dynamic way of drawing words out and learning how to hear words with your eyes so that Granddad's mind can still be of some use to the group 300 years after he's died in places where he's never went. Millions of minds. What do millions of minds do? Maybe they draw out numbers and they argue and then they send each other to the goddamn moon. And that's not to say Neanderthals were stupider. Maybe they weren't. We really don't have hard evidence that they were. Stupid is as stupid does, and they did a lot, and they did it for a very long time before Homo sapiens ever showed up. But a room full of averagely intelligent people can solve a lot more problems and deal with a lot more complication in general than one very smart guy who can't work with anybody. It's strange. The oldest human remains that we've found so far anyway, of somebody who definitely had Neanderthal ancestry. And actually he had enough Neanderthal ancestry in his genome, this guy did, that it's conceivable, it's conceivable, not likely, but conceivable, that he actually knew that his Neanderthal ancestor was still alive. And it's possible. What's more likely is that his parents or grandparents had been born when their nearly purely Neanderthal ancestor had been born. And that guy's remains were found in Israel. How's that? Huh? Makes you want to reread Genesis a little bit, doesn't it? Maybe read it a little bit slower. Maybe take a couple of extra little phrases out of there and wonder, was there a little bit more to this? You know? What people were Cain afraid to go out in front of? Just who all was there? Because we know that they were remarkably different than Homo sapiens. But we also, there can be no doubt that these people weren't human beings. And they were human beings. And we're human beings.